Welcome everybody to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Make sure to take a minute, invite some folks in, like the video if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Looking forward very much to this discussion today. I haven't had my therapy in, well, it hasn't been quite as long because Lara and I and Steven, all three of us did a talk at Making Worlds a few weeks ago. But that one was not live streamed, and so this is the first time. I don't know, probably a little over a month at least since we've had a conversation on this platform. So looking forward to it. Lots and lots to talk about today. We're primarily going to talk about elections and how the psychological impact of them, and the framing of psychological warfare. We can talk a little bit about the title that Lara and I went back and forth on a little bit. And all right, before I do that though, I do want to just share my screen real quick and just note for folks that Daruba Ben Wahad, as many of you already know, I'm sure many of you have contributed, I have as well, to his GoFundMe. This has been going on for, I want to say, at least 8 months, 9 months, that he's been trying to raise $10,000. And so he's like less than 300 away from that goal. And so I just wanted to just raise that up. I will put a link to it in the chat as well and give folks an opportunity. Hopefully we could, I mean, who knows, maybe we could even get him over that finish line today while we're having this conversation. Certainly, I know there's like a million GoFundMes right now that are in dire need. There's a lot, from Gaza, of course. I lift this one up in particular because, one, he's been trying to do it for a long time. He's an elder. He's a revolutionary. And he also, it is Black August, right? And he's somebody who was a political prisoner, member of the Black Liberation Army, sacrificed a lot in his personal life for, the Black Liberation Movement. And so I just would encourage people to just, even if you can contribute just a little bit, to drop a little money into this GoFundMe and support Daruba in his time of need. So I just wanted to say that up front. And, from there, we will go into a discussion of elections. Let me see. Sorry. Pull up. So just to introduce my guests quickly, and to also say that we have I believe it's in the show description, but there's a playlist of conversations that we've had with Dr. Lara Sheehi, some of them also with Dr. Stephen Sheehi, since November, I think, or late October. So in this conversation, as we said, we're going to talk about elections and psychological and affective investments in empire. Lara Sheehi is an assistant professor of clinical psychology at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar. She is the founding faculty director of the Psychoanalysis and the Arab World Lab. Lara's work takes up decolonial and anti-oppressive approaches to psychoanalysis with a focus on liberation struggles in the global South. She is the co-author with Stephen Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine. There's another book she's working on, From the Clinic to the Street, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures, which will be out next year on Pluto Press. And yeah, we'll leave it there. There's more to say, of course. Lara, welcome back. It's good to be in conversation with you again.
So good to see you, especially after we met.
Yeah, we finally met in person, which was great. So, all right, where are we starting? So let's see. Sorry, my notes are a little bit scattered today. All right. So, we've been talking about psyops, right? This is something that we've been talking about since October, since as this genocide has been going on. We've been talking a lot about counterinsurgency over the last 10 months. So what are some of the ways that you find elections within the US empire operate on the psychological realm for people? As in, what are the psychic and affective dimensions of these processes, and how do they reinforce sorry, what do they reinforce force or instill among voters in the United States? I figure we'll just start there, let you say some things up front, and then we'll go through some different things that have gone on recently.
Yeah, it's a small question. Well, I think so. Let me sort of start off by there's a lot of the conversations that you and I have been having is about this idea of the psychopolitical affective, which comes from Fanon, right? And sort of being able to read processes is always having those dimensions. And I think that's the starting point. So for us to sort of undo this idea that things are just natural or arbitrary or innocent and don't play on those dimensions constantly. And that's what I've been really sort of thinking about in these last 10 months. And then our conversations together have allowed a chance for us to sort of dig a little bit deeper about what does that actually mean? Like, what are the mechanics of that? Right. So as I was sort of preparing and you sort of sent some of these things that we wanted to talk about, I was thinking about the ways in which, elections, the way they play on people in my mind, and this is a part of the psychopolitical affective, but also the coerciveness of it, right? Like all psyops are coercive in some ways. And part of it is that if you think about how elections happen, particularly in this settler colony, there's a way in which they also work to reactivate identifications. And when I mean identifications, it means like an identification with the legibility of the United States as something, that obviously ideologically has been constructed for us. Then that's what I mean about it's not innocent. It plays on affective planes where you're all of a sudden sort of asked to induce these identifications all over again. You don't get to be involved in an electoral process and not be psychically coerced into an identification. Those identifications, of course, are not innocent, right? And that's the thing. The question for us is what does this shore up? What are the ways in which this comes to play inside of us? And these things live really deep. Like you and I have had conversations, right? Like side conversations about the ways in which all of us are sort of invited into this matrix. And for me, it's a space to really push up against the places where these identifications live and how far buried they are. Even, I mean, we had this conversation maybe in the first conversation you and I had about these myths that somehow like rear their head all over again. And you're like, wait, I thought I'd worked through that, whether I'm a Marxist or an anarchist or, anti-authoritarian, anti-imperialist. And then these things come up and suddenly the myths are reactivated, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. And so I think for us also, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for a place to push up against what these identifications are, number one, right? So we can think about, I mean, at the most sort of surface level, I think about jingoism, United States exceptionalism, myths around democracy, myths around the ability to stabilize something that's like careening off course. And that's an invitation. That's both an individual invitation because that individualization of something is an invitation into the myth making around citizenship, around what a good citizen is, what an engaged citizen is, and then what are the parameters of that? And most importantly for me is what is off limits to that? Right? Like what's off limits? I'm always so fascinated by how folks who are reared in the United States or sort of very even unconsciously pulled through American exceptionalism about how one can continue to be fidelitous to the myth of democracy when every election season you are coerced into voting. This is a coercive process, right? And it's something that many of us have thought about already, but I just kind of want to name it and put a real point on it is that every time you are asked to do this dance, especially if two parties, right? That by virtue of that, that coercive position where you're asked to choose and then shamed if you don't, that is a psychopolitical affective coercive process that's already happening. And that plays on identifications, because if we didn't have identifications with what it means to be an engaged citizen, what it means to be a good citizen of the United States, what the fantasies of the United States and the world are, there might not be that conflict internally. So it's almost an invitation for us to think about, like, when we feel that churning, when we feel that conflict in any way, right? I'm not saying this to shame, it's to pay attention, because those are the places where ideology, those are the places where the violence actually plays on you psychically. Is these little spaces where you're just like, oh, wait a second, like, am I going to be able to do this the time that November rolls around? Am I actually going to be able to commit to the things that I have been saying to myself, or I've been seeing for the past 10 months? That space of wonder, or that sort of teetering, is our clue about what is happening psychically. And if we wind back, a lot of the things you and I've been doing is like learning how to read these processes, and winding back is like tracing that it's actually a blueprint about all the ways in which these things live inside of it. That's what I mean when I say these things get lodged inside of us in particular ways. And that's not an easy thing to wrangle with. It's like a daily commitment to be able to disrupt. When we say disrupt settler colonial logics in a daily way, that is the commitment we make, that, we do this all the time. There's a way in which, like, I veer away from using the concept, even though I work with decoloniality and I sort of think about decolonization, obviously, I tend to veer away from this statement of decolonizing our mind, because I'm always afraid that that can be co-opted psychically into a place of like arrival, that we will just arrive, that there's all these things that we do, and then we get to a place where our mind is decolonized. And I'm not saying we do that consciously, but this is the force of the oppressive structures that are around us, that are always working on seams of identification, that are always working to seduce us into these places. And so it's more like an ongoing process of disrupting coloniality. And coloniality are the ways that get lodged inside of us psychically, relationally, politically, economically. That's the part that I'm kind of working on. But yeah, I think that's our starting point, is like, when you think about electoral politics, what is it that's being dredged up? And what are the associative processes that you actually have to sign on for, right? You don't get to engage in electoral politics and say you don't believe in the United States, or you don't believe in the ways that the United States functions, or that you don't believe in democratic processes, right? I'm not saying that everybody that engages in electoral process doesn't think about these things, but I think it's very important for us to say that there is a psychic process that's happening when you are invited into this process.
Yeah, and I mean, there's like this. I mean, I think about it in relation to the genocide, obviously, that's going on right now, and the continued support of it, from both candidates, and that the way that then gets sort of levered in the conversation is like that. It becomes this sort of like, well, they're the same on this issue, or maybe Trump would be worse on this issue. And so therefore, like, you just have to set that aside, right? This is like one of the things that you're asked to do, right? Is to say, well, we might disagree with Kamala Harris on foreign policy.
Right.
Let's set that aside, right? Because it's unrealistic for us to, and so like immediately then, I mean, I think about it from a movement perspective, and I want to move into a conversation a little bit about counterinsurgency on this and how it operates, because I
Yes.
think it's very clear to see how that works. But, I think about that in terms of this moment and people mobilizing around this, and some people within those spaces, people who have been a part of mobilization, organization, support, saying, deciding, okay, well, actually, I'm going to put my energy. I mean, this is where it gets very practical to me, too. I'm going to put my energy into campaigning for
Yes.
this person who is very clear that she's not, you know, she keeps reaffirming Israel's right to defend itself, keeps, affirmed their right to defend themselves against Hezbollah recently,
Yep.
um, like, and doing this as, the Zionist entity is engaged in assassination campaigns currently against, for one, Ismail Haniyeh, the guy who would be brokering the ceasefire from Hamas's side, right? And so you're saying that you want ceasefire, right? But you're saying also that I'm not going to criticize the entity that just assassinated the person who is engaging in the ceasefire and has been for 10 months for Hamas, right? Which is one of you know, the key brokers of that, right? Obviously, they would, both the Zionist entity, Hamas, the rest of the resistance would have to agree to terms on a ceasefire. And if you kill the chief negotiator in that, whatever else, it certainly sets that process back and makes it seem like it's not being very engaged in good faith or in very realistic fashion right now. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, that part is just also, I think, really on a we'll talk more about voting, but it's also, to me, it's the voting, and it's like the energy and the investment and the time that people also put into it, right? It's like, because ultimately we're talking about organizers, and we're talking about activists, and we're talking about people who are engaging in various ways in politics
Mhm. Mhm.
and making a choice to say, I'm going to engage in
Right.
electoral politics in this moment, I think says something very specific too.
Mhm. Mhm.
um, so
Yes.
yeah, I don't know if you want to respond to that. I can go another place if you
No,
know.
I was thinking about, as you were talking about, the ways in which obviously fear is mobilized in a particular way, but I'm not saying that just as a surface thing. Like the mechanics of that for me also, when I think about it, is that how it always uses a temporal psychic plane, right? To mobilize that fear and to siphon off and demobilize, right, the energies that otherwise were going elsewhere. We see this, by the way, patterned in the United States. Like people get, and then electoral season comes around, and there's a way in which everything gets siphoned off into the electoral process, and somehow, people start, even people who are like saying the things that we know electoral politics doesn't do anything, but my energy is better served here, right? Um, and that's what I mean by temporal psychic plane also. But and the temporal psychic plane is not just like a temporal timestamp where it says, okay, now these are the times that are contoured for this action, which give us clue enough that when it's planned in that advance and sort of becomes patterned in that way, that it can't be also spontaneous or generate anything other than what the foreclosed possibilities are, because it's on a patterned, process of, let's say, every 4 years or whatever. But the temporal psychic plane also for me is that there's a way in which fear is mobilized by always enticing us to think that what we fear is off in the future, right? And so you are asked also to join into a process of, let me engage right now. The urgency is right now to stave off whatever comes afterwards, right? And that becomes the focus. That becomes a legible fear. The fear is always what could possibly happen. And I think there's a way in which psychically we can think about this, is that it is actually very overwhelming sometimes for folks to think about what's already here. And so the psychic maneuvering is always to displace it into what's to come, right? And what would happen if we were just like, hey, all the shit that you're fearing that's coming is actually already here? And I know a lot of people say that, but that's the piece to say, like, what is happening psychically when there's always an invitation to think about the thing that's going to come? Oftentimes that's a hypothetical. And oftentimes it's also joined by a promise that we can ameliorate that through a particular way. And wow, what a surprise. Hey, here, I have the mechanism that you can do this, right? I saw this post the other day where it's like, vote harder, vote harder, vote harder. Everything's like that investment, that mechanism is already in place. That mechanism is one that fundamentally shores up a particular process in a social order that the United States is invested in and that the imperial order is invested in, right? That again is a clue for us. I'm looking at all these ways in which we have all these psychic emotional clues to read the process and read the blueprint of at least what is happening What we choose to do with that is of course an ongoing negotiated process that we do with comrades, that we do with friends, that we do yes, exactly, that we do with the people we trust, that we calculate strategically what happens. I don't want to downplay those things. There's all these ways in which we're always engaging in strategic processes, and that happens through movements, and that, that's both collective and individuals, all these ways. But I want us to really understand about the wager we are making psychically. No identification comes without an investment. And if you invest somewhere, you're de-investing elsewhere, right? And that we just have to be honest about that and understand the ways that psychic energy is being sort of manipulated, and we are being asked to join in some sorts of ways to effectively excise and give up certain parts of ourselves. That's the put it aside, right? There's a fantastical process that happens there too. You have to actually believe in that fantastical process to be able to sequester these things. I'm more interested in us being able to tell the truth about what happens when we do those things. If you want to engage that way, I would also like us to be honest about who it is that you are distributing the responsibility to hold up the militant arm of not bending, right? And that is happening. You don't get to do one thing and then say, oh, I'm still part of this movement that's actually trying to reorganize reality as it is and push past what we have come to think and be invited into to think are foreclosed possibilities of what the context of the United States looks like, right? There's a way in which fighting against psyops is also our ability to tell the truth about what's happening and what are the compromises we end up making for a variety of reasons. Again, I'm not trying to, sometimes you need to shame people like fascists, even though they don't have shame. That's okay. But I'm saying right now, it's to really be able, if we're going to start to see the ways that the pernicious ways in which empire works on us internally and psychically and politically, then part of it is also a truth telling about those compromises and why we make them. Right? Like, I'm interested in us being actually honest about that.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to talk then a little bit to get into kind of a counterinsurgency discussion. And I'm glad Two Black is tuned in right now because I'm going to use something that Two Black shared with me years ago, which I go back to. I've used it in other conversations on counterinsurgency. It's from Shama Yu's book, The Ungovernable Society. But there's a section in there that deals with how it's related to, they use a specific campaign. So they look at the campaign against Nestle. For folks who don't remember this, Nestle was giving like formula, baby's formula in the global south under conditions that they knew the people in the global south didn't have the ability to properly treat. Like, I can't remember exactly what it was, they couldn't boil it or something, but anyways, basically what it meant was that they were going to be poisoning their own children with the baby formula, right? And Nestle didn't really do anything, to stop this from happening, right? They were just interested in making the profit. And and so there was a big campaign around this, right? Again, because of the kind of genocidal
Yep.
dimensions of something like this. And obviously was happening in the third world, right? So it's happening to people with less access to the courts, ways to hold people accountable, et cetera, right? Especially when a company's coming from the United States, right? Or Europe. I'm actually not sure if Nestle's originally from the United States, but a multinational corporation nonetheless. And so anyways, in that they were losing this campaign, and so then they hired counterinsurgents, right? They hired, and this is why I think it's so important for people to understand counterinsurgency, right? Is because what happens is people work for the CIA, they work for the State Department, they work for any of the arms of military. They learn counterinsurgency. When they leave those jobs, they have a set of skills, to use a Liam Neeson reference, that is very valuable, right, to the corporate the local governmental, the electoral realm, right? In terms of really a way to think about counterinsurgency is like, how do we break up movements? How do we demobilize people? How do we fracture something that's strong, that's, coming at us, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so they use this, and so there's a little chart or a little page I'm gonna pull up from the text, and Two Black might even be able to drop a link to where he found this specific, if not, I'll find it in a second. But the chapter is called "The Dominant Dialogy" or something along those lines. But let's see, window. Okay, all right. So this part here is what I want to kind of focus on. So um, basically this idea of movements have four groups. This is like counterinsurgency, how they're thinking about this in this time, right? And there's other versions of this, but it's pretty good and it's pretty simple and it's similar to how they generally think, right? So basically the argument would be insurgents or movements are made up of four types of people. One is the radicals. They want to change the system. They have underlying socioeconomic political motives, are hostile to enterprise as such, may be extremist or violent with them. There is nothing to be done, right? We can't change in the same. There's the same thing within counterinsurgency literature when you're dealing with armed insurgencies in other countries, right? They'll say the people who are like the diehards, the true believers, like you either have to kill them or isolate them. Like that's the only thing you can do. Um, the opportunists, these offer visibility, power, followers, and perhaps even employment. The key to dealing with opportunists is to provide them with at least the perception of a partial victory. A partial victory. Let's come back to that later. The idealists, these people are usually naive and altruistic. They apply an ethical and moral standard. The problem with them is that they are sincere and as a result very credible, except they are also very credulous if it can be shown that their opposition to an industry or its products causes harm to others and cannot be ethically justified, they are forced to change their position. Again, they're thinking about this in relation to Nestle, which is why they talk about products and, et cetera. Um, the realists, these are a godsend. They can live with trade-offs. They are willing to work within the system. They want to work within the system. They are not interested in radical change, but are pragmatic, right? So I'm going to, well, do you want me to leave that up or do you want to just respond? I could take it down and you can respond.
You can, I mean, I just
I can
want
pull it back up if you want to
to,
reference it at any
yeah,
point.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think just to first tell folks is like sometimes when we read these things, we're just like, are you kidding me? Like this is what this is when we think about these like, nefarious ideas and like people sitting down and hashing out these like super complicated plans. And then like me, especially as I'm reading this, I'm like, this is your analysis. This is your but I want us to take this seriously because this is the way that people, and it's a good shorthand for us, is that if there are counterinsurgencies, literally manuals that are saying these are the way that you target people, these are the seams upon which you push, these are your entry points. We can flip it and also say to ourselves, oh, then if there's a way in which they're recognizing that the entry point is also along relational and psychic lines, because effectively for me, as you do those categories, it's the ways in which you can entice people. The radicals are not, you can't entice them. There's nothing to do with them. You just have to off them, right? Because they're way too militant and committed and have a sort of coherent idea. And then there's all these other categories that says, what is our point? What is our point of entry? And that point of entry fundamentally is along psychic lines. Now, psychic lines is like point of entry of like actually an invitation in, but also how do you wear somebody down? What's the point of contact that you're making? What is the place of weakness? Can you play on? And I think recognizing that these are not conspiracies, this is the way power works, right? And you can see this in like any politics of like groups or leadership or even in jobs or the way that Labor organizing is also targeted, right? It is a good reminder for us that these are the blueprints that they're following. And so what does it mean for us to shore up our psychic defenses against these things? And that is why practicing how to refuse psychic intrusions is important. It is why divesting from things like dialogue. How do we imagine that these things happen? It's because people invite you to be in conversation and they take advantage of the fact that you actually are, and this is the part that's not cynical, it's actually true, you actually are invested in transforming the world. And part of transforming the world does include all these strategizing and being in conversation with people in all these sorts of ways. And so recognizing that people are actually not in good faith, not engaging, like if that is our starting point, right? Our starting point is that this is how power works. Institutions really are as bad as we've been seeing them in the last several months. This is our starting point, and that like power is invested in its own longevity. Then we can also start to counter, right? Work. There you go, dialogue, right? Um, and it's interesting because, of course, and Fanon and Wretched of the Earth, I think Stephen was talking about this when we were at the event in Philly, is like, it's not by chance then when people pick up arms, it's when the elite and power start to be interested in dialogue. Right? That is when. So when these things get deployed is also really important for us to know. It's not like the starting point is dialogue. The starting point is force, oftentimes, threat, mobilization of fear, mobilization of what you're actually going to lose, right? So there's also this coercive way in which power understands that you kind of have to threaten what could possibly be lost. But if there are these manuals, we can also understand that people recognize that folks who are fighting oppressive regimes and who have gotten, again, this is a Fanonian concept, but also any sort of liberation movement that we've said, is that like they're kind of impervious to that because you've stolen everything from them already. And there's a breaking point at which this happens. And so there's all these ways in which that is mobilized, right, as an invitation. And it's a reminder for us. I like using these counterinsurgency conversations have been so helpful because it's helped me think about, okay, what are the mechanics of like, you know, understanding this is actually happening and these are not innocent, these dialogues. And then dialogue actually takes people offline. Because when you're dialoguing and you're actually doing it in good faith, you're also you're giving up something, right? Usually as a precondition to actually even engage in that. And that's what in our book where we talk particularly about psychoanalytic innocence, about the ways in which psychoanalytic institutions actually do this. The other thing I want to say, and first of all, To Black, I love your work. And folks, if you haven't watched the most recent episode, which is now like months ago, but that was an awesome episode. So go ahead and watch it. And I don't know if you can drop that link in, Jared, but I love that conversation between
the laundering black rage
yes,
one.
laundering
Yeah,
black.
one of the ones that the evil overlords at Google YouTube demonetized for absolutely no reason that I appealed and lost to.
Yeah.
But
Well,
yes,
it's
I'll drop
because
that in there, and people should check out Black Miss podcast if they don't. A lot of great conversations over there. So yeah,
I mean,
including the one most recently was that that Magneto and Charles Xavier are not MLK and Malcolm X as was previously thought. They were Menachem Begin and Ben Gurion,
oh,
right? So this was actually the original the person that created that arc around Magneto as a Holocaust survivor. Their vision of the two of them was that one represented Menachem Begin and one represented Ben Gurion, and so
we'll talk about
that
identifications, right?
yeah, exactly, right.
Yes. Yeah, so watch, and I think the reason why it was monetized is because God forbid that we should actually say Black Rage, right? And it doesn't matter what context it's in, but that's not allowed, especially on YouTube. So, but part of why I thought about that just because you said that To Black was tuning in. But the point that I want to get at here is also that the reason why I'm really invested in the psychic aspects of this and why bringing up this counterinsurgency piece is that because the CIA and places of influence, including, by the way, policy makers that we are seeing right now are saturated with folks that know psychological science and know the way that psychic warfare works. And here I'm also specifically talking about psychoanalysts. So there's two examples that I want to give, and why it becomes important for us, again, to constantly be honing in on the psychological aspect of this, because as far as we can remember, people knew, right? I mean, remember, the American Psychological Association was intimately involved and continues to be in terms of torture in Guantanamo Bay, right? There are all these ways in which the helping fields have also been utilized and mobilized specifically to take people offline and to target and invade the province of the mind, both in this temporal psychic stamp that I'm saying about the fear, right, whipping up fear, but also actually the mechanics of how the psychic works. So the two examples is at the event that we were at, that we were doing in Philly, I had mentioned that a colleague of mine had told me about a psychoanalyst who coined the term psychological warfare. And that guy's name is Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays is a psychoanalyst and Freud's nephew, right? And he worked with the CIA and United Fruit Company to destabilize democratic governance throughout Latin America. So that's number one. This is how intimately involved people are. The other thing that I want to say is right now, in the context of the United States, when we're all getting wrapped up in like, let's stave off what's happening, and particularly around issues of transness and protecting trans kids especially, there are psychoanalysts that are intimately involved in providing cover and psychological science, and I'm putting it in quotes specifically because it's in pseudoscience, but are lending credibility to all of these anti-trans bills that we are seeing being passed or being pushed through. So it's really actually part of these counterinsurgencies to also say, is map this course and say, psychoanalysts, psychologists, people who think about psychic work have always been intimately involved in the infrastructure of power. And that means that we have to be clear on the ways in which this is being mobilized against us and through us, right? To be able to see what the actual effects are. So when we're thinking about this hypothetical, what's coming in the future, what about what's happening actually right now, right? And there are all these ways in which we really need to be careful about that. My dear friends and comrades, Avi Sagatulo and Anne Pellegrini, talk about this all the time. They have a great book called Gender Without Identity, and really map the ways in which, as a field and as mental health practitioners, we are intimately involved in these power matrices. We're intimately involved in actually affecting policy. So why wouldn't we be intimately involved in also aiding the imperial project, right? Another aspect of this in the context of the settler colony and the Zionist entity, we map this in our book about how psychologists and supervisors, particularly Israeli Jewish psychologists, are intimately involved in the practice of a settler colonial social order, right? So I think this way in which constantly reminding ourselves, this is what I mean about pushing up against coloniality, is that to remind ourselves that these pieces are always intimately involved in shaping the ways that we are invited and seduced into psychically investing energies into certain modes of being. It's never free of that, right? And I think the constant reminder of that, for me, even though it might not give us a toolkit that you were saying about like, okay, how do we address that, is a constant thing. That's a constant process that comes into being, because every moment's going to be different about how we strategize how to do that. But to, at the very least, start off with the fact like this is actually happening. And this is happening not in the abstract and not in a conspiracy way, but actually we have a historical process that is mapped out for us about how these things work.
Yeah, right on. All right. So where to next? There's so much to cover. And so many places we could go. Let me see. What did I have here? So I'm going to pull up one more part of that. one more part and just read from it to just talk a little bit more about how counterinsurgents. It's, again, these are like, this is an example, and the reality of counterinsurgency, when you read their work, some of the people who are more adept at it and have many more years in the field, they'll say, you have to adjust these things, right? Like they give you certain, they have their dogma and they have their approaches, but there's a lot of disagreement within the field. There's a lot of different approaches to counterinsurgency. So I don't want to get people, make them think as though what I'm presenting is the only way that counterinsurgency works, but it's kind of an example from that campaign that, again, I think is sort of illustrative. And so, um, that's actually not the. Let's see. No, that's not it. Hang on. All right, I have it on something else. I'm going to pull up. All right, got it. Apologies, folks. All right. So faced with protests, the way forward is always the same: to negotiate with the realists, knowing that in most issues, it is the solution agreed upon by the realists which is accepted, especially when business participates in the decision making process. Also, the idealists need to be re educated into realists, an educational process, according to Duchin, which requires great sensitivity and understanding from the educator. If you can manage to work with the realists and re-educate the idealists, they will switch over to your position. Often these critics of conscience have been turned, once these critics of conscience have been turned, the radicals will lose the broad credibility that the support of these moral authorities had conferred on them. Without support from the realists and the idealists, the positions of radicals and opportunists are seen to be shallow and self-serving. At this point, you will always be able to count on the opportunists to accept the final compromise. The premise is that the radicals derive their strength only by drawing closer to more moderate blocks. Without this link, they are negligible. Radicals isolated in their niche of radicalism are harmless and pose no threat, a bit of minority folklore without any impact. Such, then, is the general strategy: to cooperate with the realists, to converse with the idealists so as to convert them into realists, to isolate the radicals and gobble up the opportunists. So again, like I want to say this and bring it back to electoralism and like the discourses that we hear
Yes.
around elections and
Yes.
around um you know different groups of people, right? And around the idea then becomes that those pro-Palestine supporters, the people who are committed to that cause, who say, I'm not going to vote for Kamala Harris because she was vice president throughout this genocide. She has given us no indication that her policy would be any different. I'm not going to vote for Trump either because quite clearly he's in the same boat. So I'm not going to participate. I'm just going to continue to organize around this issue, right? Those people then in this kind of process, would be the ones that this group would say they're the radicals. We can't actually reach them. So then the idea is to draw in these other layers. And you know, the interesting part too about the idealists and re-education, like, I always find it fascinating when like capitalists use the language of
Yes.
re-education,
Yes.
but that is, there's always this is a common refrain that we always hear, right? Is like young people are too idealistic, or there's these,
Yes.
idealistic young folks and radicals, and and there's a reason why that's such a important discourse and thing that we're taught like over and over and over again,
Yes.
right? And and then the opportunists, and this is, you think about like I think the opportunists were the group that it said bring a lot of followers and bring a lot of, which they're not even thinking about like social media followers, but I'm thinking about that too,
Yeah,
right? Because a lot of times these people who, uh, were pro-Palestine 6 months ago when it was horrendous and there was so much social media attention to it, and it seemed like the right thing to do for them to put out some statement or put a meme in or like, whatever they felt compelled, maybe, or maybe they just saw it as an opportunity, right? You
mhm,
know,
mhm.
and then now some of those same people, are saying, "Oh, I realize I'm not a leftist, I'm a Democrat," right? Like, because, we gotta get out the vote um, for Kamala, right? And you guys are being unrealistic. Like, you're being childish. You're thinking about just this one issue, and we have all these other issues that we need to think about. Let's be realist. Let's be pragmatic here.
Yes.
We need to, and so again, this is like a language of just priming people of compromise, right? And also of demonizing people, right, who are being very committed and saying, you know what, like it's a genocide. This is a once in a lifetime, or whatever, like a huge moral, uh, whatever, like how it's a big freaking deal. There's not,
Yeah, yeah,
there's
yeah.
not a lot
Every single
that's,
issue because it's fucked up. Yes. Yes,
you know,
yes,
um, and that it shouldn't just be like something like let's leave the genocide off the table so that we could talk about all of these bread and butter issues,
yes,
that matter to the working class in the United
yes,
States
yes,
or to whatever, right? And so yeah, anyway,
yeah.
I've said enough, but
Yeah,
yeah, I'm sure you have sad thoughts.
I mean, this you hit it right on the head. I just kinda wanna drill down again on the mechanics of it because I think there's a way in which, reading these things, reading the mechanics and making them concrete is something I have actually been working on a lot because I've been told that sometimes I just stay in the abstract. And so going to the concrete is really important. There's two things that immediately jump out to me from this thing that you read and then the commentary that you just said about it is number one, this is why Palestinians specifically, and then all of us, particularly Arabs who are involved in resisting the Zionist entity, are so invested in resisting normalization because everything you're talking about is a process of normalization, right? And this piece that you read maps out precisely how normalization happens. So when we say the refusal has to be militant and all the way, and you can't even engage, it's precisely because what this captures, what you read captures, is that this is an interconnected dynamic that counterinsurgency is reliant on. And that's actually a really important piece for us to think about because that's the piece when people start thinking, well, what will it do if I give in here? It's not like those people, or when you just rely on militants to hold the line. The reason why it can't work is precisely because of this dynamic that people rely on, that power relies on, right? So, this interconnected dynamic, actually, you're dropping the line to turn into electoral politics, let's say, is not just an individual choice. It actually is an ecosystem, right? That power is reliant on to further isolate, right? Militant positions. And the end point of that, of course, is that you are going to get fucked too, right? Because there's also this way in which like there's always an invitation to like if you join us, you get the cash out. Like if there's anything we can read about whether it's capitalism or imperialism, it's like you're not getting that cash out no matter how much you pretzel yourself into things. We know this about white supremacy, we know this about proximity to whiteness. It's like it never works, but the dynamic is actually laid out for us. And that is why the interconnectedness of that dynamic and why not dropping the ball, right? Why not succumbing to re-education to prove, to become legible as a reasonable subject, right? That is what is being relied on. And of course, when you think about reasonable subject, it's like, oh, for you, when we start really picking at it, reason starts to be that you just succumb to the fact that we live in a world that will criminalize poor people or unhoused folks, that, you're just going to have winners and you're going to have losers, and that's the way it is. Like, that's what is we're saying here. That's the normalization efforts, and why we understand that when you give even an inch, it is not just that inch that is given. It activates this entire sequence that has a pre-proposed plan. And again, this is where I go back to Fanon. It's like, it's not, when you say it's not a thinking machine, it's just invested in its own longevity. There are mechanics that are thought through. But in the end, this entire thing that you laid out for us in the Counterinsurgency Manual, it's like, it stabilizes something. It stabilizes empire. It stabilizes power. It stabilizes the mechanics of that. And it insists on a foreclosed possibility of living, the center of which is capital and empire and accumulation. Right? So you actually are a centerpiece of that. And that's what I mean about the truth telling that comes into that. The other piece that I want to say is that this language that is used is not by chance, right? So I was consulting with, was invited in as a sort of consultant type, the weird word, but that's the best word I have, to student organizers in one of the UC system schools. And they were showing me the chancellor's, like 100-page report that he sort of put out as a way to attack the encampments. And it's loaded with words that on their surface seem like something we would all be, invested in. Reason, of course, all words of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, naivete, being realistic, all these sorts of things. And then we can come back to this Counterinsurgency Manual and be like, this is why these types of words have actually psychic cachet. Because there are all these, again, going back to identifications, there's all these ways in which multiple modes of your being are being played on when we mobilize words like, you are not being realistic, you are being selfish, you are focusing on a single issue, you are doing this, you are doing that. There's all these different places within you that's playing on, related to, of course, your, again, the ideal citizen, how well you care for people. Where I want to sort of go with this particular to electoral politics is this is where we see identity politics and really come online in a way that then that stops up any other possibilities, precisely because they are being mobilized in the way they should be mobilized, right? And here's where I often say, I'm not the first person who says this, but I just want to say it again. It's like, it's white supremacy that creates identity, right? And then folks identify with these identity categories, and rightfully so, people who are leftist or sort of understand why these mechanisms actually stop up radical potentials, push up against these things, right? But I don't think we can take it offline as a primary place where these counterinsurgent efforts are actually playing, right? Like, this is the site that we're seeing right now, where we see Kamala, who has been, there's a reason why she's called top cop. Like, it's not like we have amnesia about what she does, but in the context of the United States, where identity politics becomes the seams through which this counterinsurgency process actually plays out, that is why we have to pay attention to these types of representational politics. That's why we have to pay attention to identity politics in this way, because it actually does pull people in. And it pulls people in because there's a sordid history of this settler colony that plays upon those lines, and also invites people into understandings of identity that moves away from analyses of oppression and proximity to power, more to the more like accumulation mode. The more of us we have, right, the more the less likely we are going to be targeted. I mean, we don't have to look at anything very far in history to see, like, that has actually never happened. That never happens, precisely because it is a lie. It is one that, like this manual, relies on an interconnected dynamic, right, where people are giving up a lot just to take up these positions. And in the context of electoral politics, the most important thing psychically is when I say, like, you are asked for an identification. For identification, you have to give something up. The entry point might be Blackness or womanhood when it comes to Kamala, right? Or mixedness or whatever version of that, because we see all the versions too. It like plays on every version, right? That's the entry point. But what you are fundamentally asked is that you are American first, right? Because that's really the point that we're getting at. The invitation is through the identity politics of it that was created by white supremacy in a settler colony such as the United States. But once you get through that entry point, the actual ask is that shit doesn't fucking matter, because Kamala's not doing anything for the communities that are being asked to rush to save her. Primarily also Black women, who will again be the ones who shoulder everything, right? In the end, when you peel that, the ask, the demand, the coercion is you are American first. And that's the shame. That's the shame part. That's the identification. You have to identify as an American. And to identify as an American, you have to believe in the myths of American exceptionalism in terms of the beacon on the hill, all the shit that you might not even think that you believe in. Fundamentally, that is the centerpiece here. And the entry points can look like anything, right? It can look like demonization of Palestinian protesters, which we are seeing and we will see. Everything will be pinned on that. Because like you said, counterinsurgency is constantly shifting. It can't be just one mode. It has to hit every mode, right? But again, if we peel back, the identification that people are being invited into is American first. And American first means you give up everything else. Right? Because that is the piece that actually matters the most, and everything else that makes it coherent, then you have to do.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting too, even to think about this in light of like 2020, right, where you had like the George Floyd uprising, rebellions, you had all of these mobilizations. This then gets funneled very much by a lot of even the organizations who were involved in the mobilizations into electoral politics. Joe Biden gets elected, but then afterwards, right? Like the movement around defunding police totally evaporates.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is about more money, more police, right? And the people who like hit the streets, who, they were crazy radicals. Like that's the way that gets that, very quickly the memory of this gets, and now you have, not only Democratic folks in Atlanta, but also the Joe Biden's Justice Department, et cetera, right? Still prosecuting cases from that. You have Stop Cop City, right? So you have all these incidents, right, where in many cases, not always, but in many cases, it is Democratic, you know, district attorneys, states attorneys, federal folks that are then, prosecuting these cases against the more insurgent, the people who weren't willing to just compromise or weren't willing to just say, okay, like we get this election of this guy who, has been central to expanding police and prison power for his whole career. And that's what we get out of this rebellion, right? So yeah, I mean, we see these dynamics again and again. I just wanted to shout out, as always, Dylan Rodriguez. This book, White Reconstruction, Domestic Warfare and the Logics of Genocide, it, he has a term in here that he uses, multiracial white supremacy. And it's, he's thinking a lot with these things of counterinsurgency, settler colonialism, imperialism, the Philippines also, which is one of the early sites of U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine. And yeah, how they all blend together, but also to that point that you are raising about the sort of identity politics as we think about it, not identity politics as like, Combahee River Collective meant it or whatever, but identity politics in terms of, liberal or neoliberal identity politics, these identitarian politics I've heard people talk about, where it's like,
Mm-hmm.
it is based upon the identity of the person like as the politic as opposed to the actual politics
Yes.
of the person, right?
Yes. And an actual,
So
what I would say is in that version, and I mean it, thanks for clarifying, I do mean it like that as well, right? Is that there's a displacement of the actual identity people think they are shoring up. Because to be an American first also means that you actually have to give up those claims and the sort of historical specificities of that, and how the United States machinery insisted upon a flattening of those specifics precisely to engage in the oppression of those specific, right? So it's a circular machine that you're actually, not yeah, identity reductionism is another way to think about that precisely. But there's a way it's to recognize that. The second, again, these are ways that we can sort of recognize that we're caught up in this interconnected dynamic and be like, in this moment, if you're feeling like conflicted or guilty, right? Like, how can I not support a Black woman? Is to ask, to sort of push upon those spaces of like, what is being stabilized here? And is this actually, what is being represented here in that symbol of the Black woman? Of course, we've seen this a million times before. Like, we need another, like, I feel zero identification as a woman, zero identification with somebody who's going to bomb the shit out of my people. Right? But I can understand the ways in which that is precisely targeted and flattened such that distinguishing feature becomes erased entirely. And we are asked to mobilize around that. That becomes even more so, by the way, in the context of fascism, because we understand how, and this is the part I think sometimes that we forget, right? We sort of get very angry around identity reductionism, as we should, but we forget the pieces of like, what is actually being mobilized psychically? Why do people invest so much in that? It becomes even more pointed and more dangerous under times of fascism, precisely because the targeting is so intense. And we can't forget that part. We actually have to create different possibilities precisely because people are being targeted. And then the fear is going to be mobilized around that too.
yeah, I think this next clip will be helpful to kind of bring some of what we've talked about home a little bit here.
Donald Trump, on the other hand, has been talking a big game about securing our border, but he does not walk the walk. Or as my friend Quavo would say, he does not walk it like he talks it. Where's Quavo? So look, our administration worked on the most significant border security bill in decades. Some of the most conservative Republicans in Washington, D.C. supported the bill. Even the Border Patrol endorsed it. It was all set to pass. But at the last minute, Trump directed his allies in the Senate to vote it down. Right. He tanked the bipartisan deal because he thought it would help him win an election. Which goes to show Donald Trump does not care about border security. He only cares about himself.
So there we go. I mean, so the obvious point that I would make is that this is an extremely fascistic border bill that
Yes.
we're talking about here.
Yes.
I mean, we're talking about something that she says some of the most conservative Republicans, and it is true what she's saying. I mean, Trump did tank it because it was his bill, and he didn't want his bill to pass under a Democratic administration because then they could take credit for it. So that part is actually true.
Yes.
But it's to be actually running on, I mean, that to be should be one of the most shameful moments of the Biden-Harris administration, right? That they caved so far to the right. Uh, you know, I mean, it's interesting to watch a little bit because if you watch the attack ads on Harris right now, part of what the right is doing is they're bringing up things she said in the 2020 election in the primaries when she's running against like Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, and she's saying things like, yeah, I think people like we shouldn't prosecute anybody that crosses the border. Like yeah, they should be able to access my medical care for all plan, which she had like a watered down kind of version of, right? Like, so, but it's very interesting, right? Because you have somebody who, when she had to compete with these, progressive, quote unquote, like liberals, right? She was bringing these policies that people on the left would tend to agree with more of, like, we shouldn't have these, fascistic borders, and we shouldn't be so punitive against people who are refugees and who are migrating against the ravages of climate change and imperialism, right? And so this is a very far right policy that she's pushing, and she's laundering it through Quavo, who's a member of Migos, who also went up to talk about gun violence, right? Because I think Takeoff was his brother. I can't remember, but anyways, the other person that's in Migos was killed, by gun violence, right? And so, like, the mobilization of these issues, right? But then to launder it through like a line, a nod to this hip hop artist, right? And I mean, that whole Atlanta, there's the Megan the Stallion thing, which people have seen. I don't think I need to replay that. The whole thing is filled with like rappers and celebrities, right? Like kind of endorsing her to the Black Atlanta community. And yeah, it's just, I mean, in watching it, the scariest part of it for me, right, is the kind of cheers
Yeah.
that she's getting from the audience around like horrible policy declarations. But it's like you make this little joke, or you talk about how Trump isn't like, he's not really dedicated to this fascist policy because he didn't want it to pass if he couldn't claim it, kind of thing. And people just kind of like gobbling that up. And I think that's part of the daunting part right now for me, and the challenging part, right, is that this desire, Cedric Robinson talked about this, of the desire that people had to be led to, right, of this like looking for a leader, and in this case a leader who, her website for her campaign doesn't even actually have a policy platform at this point. Like, it doesn't even have like, this is what I'm running on. um so anyways, but again, like all these things, the way that identity gets leveraged, the way celebrity gets leveraged, which we're seeing a lot of, and so on.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, and this is, I just kind of, first of all, it's so embarrassing. It's just embarrassing. I mean, I watched this and there's a way in which I watch this and there's such a, like, we get called shallow. And like, if you listen to it, it's like, what the fuck are you actually saying? What are you actually saying? And that's a really important thing for us, because if somebody can stand up there and say nothing, but still mobilize all there's something that's being mobilized internally, because the words and the content actually don't matter. If you listen to the words and the content, we should be having the reaction that you're having. It was like, holy shit, like, we're competing here for who can implement the most fascistic, border patrol, even the border patrol. Like, we're supposed to, but like, that should make you scared that these fascists are voting for this and even are agreeing with it, because that's, that doesn't come lightly, right? But I think there's something here to be said. I think you and I were talking before this, is that there's something about United States under, sort of over the course of the years of the settler colony, about what is understood as politics is precisely only electoral politics. And the ways in which people are socialized into that, education does that, of course, all the different, functions of the state make it such that politics are only done through electoral politics, such that we have to have these ridiculous argument, especially in psychology or something, that like our work is political. Like, I'm working with people psychologically, and I have to argue and prove to people that that work is actually political. Because I think there's a fundamental displacement of all things politics into electoral politics and therefore party politics, right? So that when I say something like, of course I take up the political in my clinical work, my colleagues often think I am talking about who to vote for. And that can be laughable, but that's the reality of it, right? So there's something about that. And that, I think, also ties into the lack of stamina that folks might have, partially because I think also the left in the United States has been decimated. And that part of leftist organizing and dreaming up and enacting worlds in a constant way is also building up the stamina that is needed to constantly fight against oppressive systems and structures that are always renegotiating themselves. They're always recalibrating. And so it needs a particular type of agility and stamina that we come together, organize, reorganize, things fall apart, we come back, we have to reorganize. That has kind of been decimated in the context of the United States. Obviously, I'm not reinventing anything. I just want to name that. I think this is part of what's at play when we see this relief. Like you were saying, the most disturbing and scary thing for you is like the cheers that people are getting. But I think there's like a manic aspect of that, of like people just really so thirsty for relief. Because what has happened in the past 10 months is a systematic decimation of the myth of United States, everything, democracy, the United States being a helper, a broker. I mean, many of us already knew that wasn't the case, but it would be a lie to say that not more people joined in the last 10 months. Of like the number of people that write me and be like, I've completely, like, this changed my life. This changed my world entirely. I don't know what I was thinking. How could I have been so naive? How could I have believed in these things in reality, right? But that means also that people stamina is like, and this comes at the perfect time. And we were talking right before it. It comes at the perfect time to come in and relieve people of that muscle flexing that is needed to commit to something like this. It comes at the right time also when the Olympics are happening, when you have the most biggest jingoistic, thing of like people rallying, and that becomes the identity, where we have like flags in our neighborhood of like Team USA. And I'm like, what? That also comes with an identification that is not just specific to sports. It's about the position of the United States in the world and its excellence and its, everything that comes with American exceptionalism. So there's that piece that I think we have to think about. And that's why I think people are genuinely horrified, and we hear this exhausted, right? It's heartbreaking to me that you take that valve of exit so quickly, when like part of what, and I think many people haven't, but I think many people have also just taken that exit, been like, okay, this is she's not perfect, but at least she's not Biden or something like that, and forgetting the systemic piece of this. The counterpoint to that, which is why she gets so many, cheers anytime she just mentions Trump. You just mention Trump. You don't have to say anything. You're going to get boos and all that, is because there's a investment in Trump as the person, right? And analysts have said this, where like you have the same shit that Biden did, but if it was Trump that was doing it, people would rally against it, versus rather than a recognition that the rise of Trump is precisely because the conditions of the United States allowed him to come into being. It is not just a singular person, but what these sort of ridiculous, shallow political analyses do is reduce it into a figurehead, which becomes an easy target, by the way. It's an easy channel. And then that sets up the stage where you're just like, the relief comes that we have a counter person to that. But if we were to understand Trump as a manifestation of the conditions of American empire, the conditions of American corruption, the conditions of American genocidal warfare, as far back as the inception of the settler colony, then that counterpiece, Camel as a counterpiece, wouldn't work as well. right? But all of these, that's again the interconnected dynamic process, and why we have to continuously push upon this idea of what are we stabilizing, go back to the condition, and all these questions that distract us, that displace, that sort of allow us to move away from the pressure points are working precisely as they are meant to be. And then we miss, like you're saying, we miss the content. Like, am I supposed to be cheering for border control here? Right? But I think Shalene also Rodriguez was on your show and talking about the changes in the demographics of who have become cops and police and all of that, and the targeting of BIPOC communities precisely for this, because that is also a psychological way. When you see all the faces behind her, right? That's an immediate invitation. And then you don't listen to the content because you're like, here's all these it's a representational politics that is not just a shallow representational politics. There's actually something psychologically that's being worked on.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Lana added, absolutely similar to pinning Zionism on Netanyahu, right? This is importantly making the connection, right? There's people who focus on, and you hear this a lot, people who are just like, oh, well, if we could just get Netanyahu out of power, like, that things would be better, right? We could move forward, right? He's a crazy outlier kind of thing. And that's even taken some level of hold, although not significantly, but within the Democratic Party, there's been floating of certain conversations around that, right? As I think they're trying to sort of test how do these different ways of dealing this resonate with people. And yeah, I mean, I think that absolutely Trump is a manifestation, and Kamala's a manifestation, and Biden's a manifestation. And, I mean, I think a good example of this is I don't think anybody rationally can watch the Joe Biden presidency and think that this is a man who's actually making significant decisions on a day-to-day basis. I mean, the guy, I hate to pick on like old people but like, anybody who watched that debate, like he's not even able to string together like coherent thoughts some of the time, right? And so the idea that like the most important decisions in our society just rest on him as an individual, right? I mean, these are the United States government, the Pentagon, the State Department, like these are massive bureaucracies that function, and that, I'm not saying that a president doesn't make certain decisions and can't make certain calls, but there's all of that within the government. And then of course there's the ruling class, right? There's what do corporations want? What do CEOs want? What do, the, the wealthiest people in the United States and empire, right? What kind of policies do they want to see enacted? How do they also enact and launder those things through the media that they own, right? And through the how to advertisers, like all of these things, we're talking about something that's much more significant than, one individual person. And I don't even want to deny to people, and I see people in the chat, like I get it in terms of Trump being scary, like being an awful person, like we've had 4 years of Trump. Yeah, like he's horrible, and so I don't want to make people think like we're sitting here to downplay, what Trump represents at all. But it is also that there is no reckoning, no accounting, that becomes always a way for the Democrats to present themselves as the rational alternative.
Yes.
Don't even need policies, right? Just can go in there and say some jokes and, like,
right.
Yeah, it's
Right.
wild. So,
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say just that we have to qualify that you always have to move in and be like, hey, we're not forgetting that Trump is bad, that he's a fascist, that all of that is a in vivo example for us about how that counterinsurgency piece that you read works on this sort of like, siloing off the radicals and asking everybody, because you start policing and disciplining people in these particular ways and moralizing and reminding them as though I don't know that Trump is a fascist, right? As though I can't remember that. But this idea, this movement into that then becomes a distraction where now I am trying to prove to you and remind you that I actually know that Trump is a fascist, rather than us going back to the structural issues that would allow fascism to take hold in this way, let alone the ways in which Biden's administration, and this has history, of course, of the Democrats, has continued most of Trump's policies, but not under Trump's name. And so that's the laundering part of it as well. And it allows us an escape valve where, again, we can reconsolidate this in the specter of Trump rather than in a fabric, a constitutional fabric of the settler colony of the United States that can only function in these ways. And it also allows, again, when that piece, I mean, one of the things in that piece that just keeps jumping out to me, and I keep wanting to say this, is that it kind of ends with saying that the radicals are negligible. Like, without the other people, they're negligible. And we hear this over and over again. This is just a niche thing. Oh, they're just radical. We're only a couple people. We really everybody outnumbers them. And yet you're making entire manuals. You're spending billions of dollars, right? Like, anti-Zionists are negligible. BDS people are negligible. We're always talking about this. And it's like and yet there's an understanding that even in small numbers, that act of militancy, that act of being unbending, that act of returning to the condition, that act of not being seduced into, but you're forgetting that Trump is a fascist, that act of militant clarity, like you and I have talked about before, that's what garners all the attention and why everybody else has to be targeted, to be able to demobilize that. We've seen that in such clarity in the last 10 months. The reason why all the Islamophobic tropes, every single propaganda machine, the psychological warfare in the streets and through the media, the making of, right, what's been called the manufacturing of crises, all this sort of shit has been precisely because what has happened is a recognition that those radicals actually are not niche, they're not negligible, and that there's a way in which they're speaking a particular type of language against oppressive structures that make things clear to people about their own oppression. And that is why you need to demobilize and take offline the idealist, the real, all this sort of shit to make sure. So it's actually, I actually don't think that the radicals might be negligible in number, but not in force and in sort of impact. But that's why you need all the other motherfuckers to jump off board, because there's a power in that sort of, and there's a recognition in that, right? Again, and this ties into the specter of Trump. Again, all these ways in which the displacement of affect and attention and psychic, this is the psychological warfare for me, right? And that's why a practice, constant practice, and a reminder of, like, why are we tasked with answering that question? Like, is that we're constantly tasked with patching up American empire. And that's the question for us. Is like, why am I joining in that task? And at whose expense? That's the honesty I'm interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always at someone's expense. And I mean, and some of that does come to settler colonialism, right, as a concept, or also obviously the history of slavery, which is also why the the kind of insidiousness of Obama and Kamala Harris, and is the way that it incorporates blackness into empire, but then doesn't do anything for the masses of black people, right? So it's like creates an identification, a psychic connection, but it doesn't do anything to ameliorate the material conditions of people, or the centuries of psychological warfare, or all the other things that they've been subjected to, right? And then obviously in the case of US as an empire, there are countries all over the world. I mean, Venezuela just had an election that is trying to be undermined by the US State Department. They actually declared the opposition candidate the winner without anything that they can even point to prove that this person won. And the part of that it comes on the back of is the context of understanding that they've been under sanctions for, a decade at least at this, more than that, but like, different levels of increasing sanctions, increased under Obama, increased under Trump, didn't get significant relief of them under Biden either, right? And so then, you know, part of it is some people do actually also vote now for the opposition, right? And this happens in other countries too,
Yeah.
that are under sanctions, of saying, hey, maybe if we just accept what the United States wants us to do, bring all of the capitalist corporate, let's privatize everything, go full neoliberalism, attack our minorities, like, go against, union or labor gains or anything like that, right? And maybe then they'll lift the sanctions and we can have a better life. And how horrible it is, like, people that they've been subjected, right? That even seems like a path that
Yeah.
makes sense to people, right? That the logic literally becomes like, an abuser, right? Logic of like, okay, if I do what the abuser is been trying to get us to do for decades now,
Yeah.
maybe then, things will be better, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And why, again, to go back to what you were saying to the begin with about the dangerousness and insidiousness of people like Obama or Kamala or something like that, is precisely because the entry point is through the identity politics that plays on a particular, that is the abusive quality, the coercive quality of it, right? But instead of ameliorating any of the structural pieces, is it actually sets in motion a series of betrayals. Like, you're constantly, engaging in betrayals of yourself and this, let's say your community, um because of the promise that all of these things will be, like, you're always asked to believe in the promise that never cashes out, right? And that actual leaning into that is a betrayal over and over and over again. I will never forget the clip of Obama in Flint, Michigan, drinking that fucking water. If anybody can forgive him after that, I don't know what the fuck you're on, right? Like, that is the betrayal I'm talking about. And it's a betrayal. It's not abstract. It's real. You are asked in that moment. He's setting up a fucking test for you. How far can I go in this? How much will you just I mean, that level of violence, that's the betrayal I'm talking about, where you are asked, you're just like, are you going to side with me? And here are the reasons why I'm going to force you to, I'm going to coerce you to. But imagine the betrayal that's involved, right? And of course, the beauty of power is that those betrayals also get just subsumed into your psychic being, such that you're like excising them and you don't actually recognize that's what's happening. I mean, that's alienation, right? You're constantly alienated from this. And then we wonder about all the, all the rest that happens and all the breaks. And that's why I think these breakdowns of those identification processes are actually very important, and they're the part that sustain us. Now, part of the question for us is, if we're asking for folks to divest, to disidentify from all these sorts of things, what's the infrastructure that we're also building that people can counter identify with? Obviously, that's what counterinsurgency is also about, is like, don't let people create infrastructure that they can actually identify with, that might ameliorate the actual structural pieces, because that abusive system is something that is necessary. It's constitutively necessary.
Yeah. It's something that Brooke Terpstra from Oakland Abolition and Solidarity talked to me about years ago, and it's I always appreciate the way that he talks about it. And he's just sort of like, you're asking people to like sort of step through a void, like they like everything that they know, right? Like being just being an anti-imperialist in some ways within the United States, right? Just take that as like it requires you to like say, gosh, everything I've been taught, or everything that, in school, at sports, and so it could be a profoundly kind of alienating thing, because you suddenly you kind of have to step through into a space where there are fewer people who you're going to be able to find, like, common cause and really be able to have the kind of conversation that we're having right now and that people in the chat are tuning into, and it's interesting. Some of the trolls have found us today. Good for them.
Oh, nice. Welcome,
um
assholes.
yeah. uh but yeah, I mean, it is something that is the task, right? The task is to actually be able to build like meaningful, sustainable organizations, movements where, there is that infrastructure that can hold people, give them kinship, give them friendship, help them to be able to deal with the kind of alienating aspects and also the challenge that comes for, like Baraka from Black Alliance for Peace said this recently, that don't get frustrated in your political conversations with people, not exact quote, but that really helped. Just saying, you're going to have conversations with people all the time
Mhm.
who aren't going to agree with the perspective, right, that we're laying out right now, and to try not to let that, not to get too angry or frustrated with them, because also understanding that, like, for many of this, I don't know if this is the case for you as much because you were born in Lebanon, right? So you had a different introduction to the United States empire. But for those of us who, went to school here, all the mythology, everything that we're shown on TV, etc., like that those types of psychological warfare, really,
Yes.
that those types of propaganda, that they're embedded deeply. And as you said, like there isn't an endpoint to that either. Like we are constantly, trying to understand and learn. That's part of this, what this process is that, not saying that we've arrived at some endpoint, but yeah, I'm with you in terms of the reality of, like, part of what people will ask out of this is, okay, so what do you have to offer me?
Yes.
Right. And the reality is, like, the Democratic Party doesn't have anything to offer you either.
Exactly.
But we
Exactly.
do need to have some things to offer people, I
Yes.
think. I
Yes.
think that's important.
Yeah, but what they do have, that's what you were saying. Like Kamala doesn't even have a platform, and everybody's just like, "Yay!" But then they might ask us, like, "What do we have to offer?" That is also a function of this, right? Actually, Stephen and I have this conversation all the time because he was born in the United States and he's an Arab American, and the ways in which, it's like in the water. To go back to the Flint, Michigan, uh, the poison is in the water, and that is also part of the identifications. And we were talking about is that when you are asked to identify as an American first, there's all these ways in which you are brought in very sophisticated ways, by the way, right? And in ways that like pop up. You and I have talked about this before. It was like, hey, I didn't even know this pocket of like, belief in the system actually was there, whether it was like, prior to Trump, people believing in checks and balances and all these things, and me having conversations with people of like, show me where this, like, how do you show me where this is? And they're just like, it just is, or like the, American judiciary being the best in the world and all the shit that gets, by the way, exported. Because was not born in the United States, but I'm somebody who grew up in a globalized world, right on the brink of that. And of course, in Lebanon and American exception, like that shit gets exported. You live on that shit. And then coming to the United States, but there is they're immediately seeing the difference between like how much undoing, and I'll talk about re-education there has to be when you are, brought up on these myths. And then there's the infrastructure around it to make sure that these myths continuously bore a hole in your psychic process, right? And what does it mean when you veer off of that? Because it's not enough just to like create channels where you will become a little robot, like an American exceptionalist robot. It's also, what are you trading off? What is the fear of what this will become if you leave this behind? Which is why we always say, you see these stupid things of like the American military being deployed in the context of the United States, and they're like, this is not Afghanistan, this is the United States. Like, that's the shit that you're also raised on, right? That the associative power of like, this is what this could become if you don't do all these things.
I saw something the other day. This was just a random person on Twitter, and they said that Kamala should choose Pete Buttigieg. This is seriously something that I saw, because he speaks Arabic, and I was like, how do you think he fucking learned Arabic? Like, what was what was he doing? Oh, wait, that's right. He was in Iraq. Like, he was like, like, he's a freaking soldier, and probably, it probably was recruited right into, because a lot of the Arabic programs become recruiting grounds for the state, for the CIA, for the army and everything else, right? And like, it's always like, it was such a laughable thing, because it wasn't even like, hey, let's like have an Arab vice president to appeal to the because this was all couched in being able to appeal to Muslim voters. It was like, oh yeah, Pete Buttigieg, yeah, that's a great.
Yes. And also, spoiler alert, he probably doesn't know how to speak Arabic, because those
sure
don't get taught how to speak Arabic because they don't give a fuck, because they're racists, right? So even that the myth of like, oh, these military guys that go and they learn Arabic, like, and that's divorced from the impact of that, or why that's a necessity, or and again, empty identitarian politics, right? Speaking Arabic then makes you palatable to the Arabic community, and I'm just like, what is that? What does that even mean? I do want to say, I'm going to put her name in the chat,
Okay.
Jared, so that you can post it. My dearest friend and comrade, Avi Sakotopoulos, you were talking about like the infrastructure of what we offer people. And she's working on this concept of exigent sadism. I'd really recommend that folks look into her work, because she's a psychoanalyst. She's sort of thinking through the ways in which we have to stage. She talks about like staging encounters that fundamentally shift our relationship to people and the world, and that there's a way in which we have to be able to sustain the breakdown rather than rush into repair, right? And that's a sophisticated psychological process. But she was doing a keynote at a recent psychological conference, and she said this beautiful statement that to me is like an abolitionist sentiment as well. And part of like, we're always thinking about, we have to offer the infrastructure already done, rather than think about what are the ways in which we bring that into being, right? And that also is shifting. And one of the things she said that I think was offered to her by somebody else, but she repeated it, and she was just like, it's almost like jumping from vine to vine, and the vine hasn't materialized yet, but with the belief that it will. Right. And like, you have to take that risk. That's what she talks about a lot, about the risk. What are we willing to risk here? And I learned so much from her around the idea of risk. And that is the stuff that psychologically is wrapped up in this, is that comes with stamina, that comes also with recognizing, I will never forget my students from Gaza when this started happening. And I was in Doha, them saying like, we've already been paying this price. The price is already paid. And so what are we disavowing when we were just like, I'm trying to stabilize this and save this, that we're forgetting that the price is already being paid, and the price is already being paid by the most vulnerable people, and will continue to be that. And so what are we actually willing to put on the line and to risk? Right.
Yeah. And I think that's great. And I think one other thing I would just add to is that, it's this often what gets said to the radicals, especially when we're talking about, within the anti-imperialist movement, within, whether we're talking about Palestine, right, or whether we're talking about other examples of people who have been opposed to U.S. wars, right, is that you're divisive, right? Like that, especially in election times, right? Yes. Is that you are the people who are you are creating disunity. And Steven Salida actually had a thread on this the other day that I saw that was really good. But the point being like that, this again, that's a nationalist view, yes. Right? Because what you're talking about is that you're saying your viewpoint represents a minority within the U.S. nation state, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't represent a minority view globally.
Yes.
Like, and at all, like there's not a bunch of other countries out in the world, except, the ruling classes of Europe, probably, that are like, hey, US imperialism, this is a great thing. Like, you guys need to keep fighting these wars. Like, I remember being in Ireland during the Iraq War, and every single person that I met in Ireland was like, did you vote for Bush? And I was like, no. And they're like, good. He's like, you Americans are fucking stupid. Like it was just like, just every person was like quizzing, like really, because they were like, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah.
Like, and that's in Ireland. That's not even in, Iraq, the Middle East,
Yes.
like,
Yes.
Africa, South America, right? And so I think that's just really important for people to understand too, and thinking about transnationalism or internationalism is like that there are much broader communities, and so like in part what you're being asked to do is to like disidentify with this kind of white nationalistic project,
Yeah.
this settler empire project, right? And so yeah, there are other communities that you can connect
Yes.
in with and be with, right, that will get it much more implicitly even by experience.
Yes.
um
Yeah, and it's the daily
yeah.
and I'm gonna say something that like seems very simplistic, but I think it's telling that we forget this, right? In mobilizing these sorts of things, where like you are creating division and unity in the United States. First of all, like that's not something to be ashamed of. If you're trying to actually create a different world, that's kind of the way it's got to happen, right? And so, what is it that when we like actually fall into the shame that's evoked in that, and that's a clue, like that's what I mean about these things, how they get stuck inside of us, and where they live is like, why does that play on us in a particular way and stop us in our tracks? That's number one. Like that's a shameful thing. Number two is, are we powerless when they say, so on the one hand they mobilize, you're naive, you're unrealistic, so are we powerless or are we that powerful? Like which one is it? Don't the fact that it can be interchangeable at any moment is also a clue to us around these things. It's like that's what I mean also about non-dialogue, is this is not in good faith. It will use anything to throw at you to stop you in your tracks with the idea that something will have traction, right? The more I can sort of find and discover the entry points that will work on you, the more likely I'm going to find traction to actually stop you in your project of disruption, of reconfiguration, of stopping up the arms and the logics of American empire and settler colonialism and oppression in general. And like it can't be both at once.
Right. There's a couple audience questions I want to get to before we kind of wrap up. The other thing I did want to say, few people made this connection. I'm sorry I didn't catch the comments, but just the connection also between the fascism that we're seeing in the UK right now, in Britain, but also I think in Northern Ireland as well, right, where we're seeing like these attacks on Muslims, on Arab communities, and on other people, right? And like this is, again, like this is what happens. Like this is a part of these processes of, why would this happen? Well, gee, the state and the media have been demonizing Arabs and Muslims for the last 10 months on top of what they've done over the last 100 years plus, right? You'll go way, way back, right? Like but like, I mean, obviously the process of Orientalism and all of that is like a extremely long thing. But there is also, the Islamophobia that was mobilized around 9/11, that has been mobilized historically in relation to Palestine in particular. I mean, some people have even talked just about the legacy and the length of anti-Palestinian racism, right, as a actually discrete concept, which I think is, is interesting and important itself, because a lot of I think Daryl Lee has shown like how much terror legislation historically has all been kind of pushed through in relation to Palestine specifically. Of course, this is connected to Zionism, right? Connected to how Zionism is deeply embedded within the U.S. state architecture. But anyway, I did want to nod to that because it's true, and it's true that is likely to. We've seen instances of it in the United States also in the last 10 months, and it is likely to continue and to increase. And there's this weird way they try to displace it across like different extremists and like both sides, then the different groups of people, right, and all this stuff. Anything to get around like, oh yeah, this is a consequence of us demonizing people through the most powerful propaganda apparatuses the world has ever known.
Right. And Stephen was telling me, I think there was somebody that was saying that these are like Iranian and Russian agents who are coming in and playing the part of white. I mean, anything, literally anything, but to actually admit, that this is a consequence of that. What I will say about this, anti-Palestinian racism is that, of course, obviously it exists, but I want us also to think about the ways in which the reason why anti-Palestinian racism might be looked at as a discrete process is precisely because it is anti-Arabness that finds its coalescence in Palestine, because Palestine is the site of revolutionary struggle. We cannot disconnect this from Arab revolutionary struggle and Arab liberation, right? And if that runs through Al-Quds, if that runs through Jerusalem, that's precisely why. So the Palestinian becomes a stand-in, right? The symbolic sort of stand-in of the actual unity, a pan-Arab unity that is about revolutionary struggle, and that is a leftist struggle. So there's a way in which also, like, just quickly, when I came to the United States, and this goes back to what we were talking about, like growing up in the United States versus not, there's these reels that sort of look at the ways in which Arabs have been demonized in American TV or film, and it was shocking to me to see. And these all come together in the ways in which just the casual anti-Arabness, the casual racism that's involved in everything from what we were talking about, like, this is not Iraq, this is this, to like the things that people drop into shows, a lot of times cop shows, of course, and shows that are sort of around military and might and all this sort of thing. But like, these are the things that become regularized and normalized, and why we need to pay attention to those ways and how those things get mobilized at particular times. To go back to the electoral conversation, right, is that when you have that specter constantly, that danger, the counterpoint, that do this so we don't become that, right? Palestine right now is front and center, and also has always been connected to a liberation fight, a leftist, right, liberation fight, in which the entire area that is now called the Middle East, or known as the Middle East, is liberated from these forces, from racial capitalism, from imperialism, and so on.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. It's really important. All right. I'm going to pull, so a couple of comments I'll just bring up just quickly. Also, anti-indigenous to continue to manufacture consent for colonialism globally. Yes, absolutely. This is an interesting point. It's highly influenced by Indian rhetoric these days, where Hindus spread lies about Muslims. Yes, like Hindu nationalism is another big site of anti-Muslim sentiment, and also interestingly connects in with UK politics because of, a lot of things. But yes, this just a comment, but I appreciate it too, for people to always remember too, is that like in terms of the overall population, like the largest constituency is people who don't vote, and I think that's usually important for people to also understand, and also think about organizing potential and everything else, but also I do want to say this too, because I think, again, like, I never want people to limit their understanding. As you said earlier on, like, this is one of the things, the psychic impacts of sort of electoral politics more broadly, is that it gets seen as the site of politics, right? And that there's a horror, I mean, there's a actual reason why millennials are killing capitalism. We have never brought on candidates. We have never done like deep dives into like, what should leftists do in terms of because we really have always wanted people to understand that revolutionary politics, like electoralism, can be a tactic within that. It can, like, there's a good history of that, right? But you have to be very clear-eyed about it. And like, I also think that like most of those contexts, if you looked at them, there's not really something comparable we're talking about in terms of the Democratic Party or the two-party system that we're talking about, right? And certainly there's not movements where, in instances where it might be similar on that kind of front, where the people who are confining their action and their activity and the way that they struggled to this electoral arena, or moving all of their like eggs into that basket, it's just not historical in terms of kind of really radical revolutionary politics. So now we'll move to a couple questions and then we'll close out. So can you talk about how fear goes underground sometimes, buried inside rational people, and what that does to them? In other words, where that fear goes when it's not expressed consciously.
Oof, that's a
It's a
great
tough one.
question. Yes, yes, thank you for that. Let me start. I mean, I think there are many ways that we might look at this, but I'm always interested in the ways in which, when it goes underground, I'm interested in all the ways in which where it is actually showing up, but we're actually think that it's underground, right? And that it gets subsumed by these ideas of rationalism. And that actually means that if you are trying to disavow fear as a central piece of it, you might actually be enticed into reinvesting in rationalism. And this is what I mean about manic. Like, I don't mean manic like you have a lot of energy. It might be an actual manic defense against the fear that I have to become hyper rationalist in this way. One of the things we've talked about here is a really interesting piece is that I am not talking about doing away with fear. In fact, fear actually is a very important mobilizing force for us. And one of the things we've talked about a lot, and this is maybe it's a question of what it does to somebody, is that there's always an invitation to zero out our affect. And that I'm always so interested in when people expect folks, and this is why laundering black rage gets demonetized, right? Is that when we expect folks to not have affect, and if we're saying all affect as political and psychic, then what does it do to them? For me, how does that play into alienation, and how does that take people offline? Right. So this is where I think you had said something earlier, Jay, when you were like, I can't remember. I have the notes right here. You were saying something about the confusion mongering. Now, I was thinking about Fanon and confusion mongering, and it's just like that is precisely what we have seen. And part of the confusion mongering that he talks about in Wretched of the Earth, and he specifically says to psychologists, you actually have a centerpiece in doing this, is because in the sort of insistence on rationalism and slowing down and doing all these things, what he's most concerned about is that we actually stay people's revolutionary fire, and we slow them down to the point where we actually infuse spaces of non-action, because people are less likely, they start to get confused themselves when before they weren't. And so maybe that's part of it, is like where fear in a generative way, not fear as it's mobilized to discipline. And I don't know which one of these fears you were really asking about, but I'm always interested in what's the fear that sort of demobilizes us, because that's the one that asks us to give up something and identify with its counterforce, usually an oppressive counterforce, oppressive to ourselves and to somebody else at a price. But also the fear of like our fear of precisely what we were saying. There's a reality testing that's involved in like there's a real fear in everything we have been seeing slowly creep up, and what revolutionary thinkers and activists and organizers have been talking about. Like part of the reason we've been preparing over the decades is because we saw this fascist turn coming, right? And like that fear to me is actually generative because it's a part of an affect. Now, how do we make it so that it doesn't take us offline is the question that I'm interested in and what I'm constantly thinking about. And the way that we go offline is through counterinsurgency, or through demonization of affect, or through thinking that we need to be hyper rationalist and there's no place for affect. There are places in which affect cannot be forefront. I need to say that because we need to act strategically. But for our movements to constantly not take up the affect that is being pushed upon us or worked through us is actually a major weakness of ours. And I think I've seen a change in that when people are talking about the psychological realm, when we're talking about psychological warfare, but we're also talking about the ways in which we can actually sustain ourselves psychically and in our groups. Those are just the initial thoughts I have.
Yeah, that's great. Just this was another comment I did want to bring up. I just saw this as it happened. The I think president or prime minister just resigned in Bangladesh, and I think this
Oh,
is I haven't followed that movement as closely, but I understand some parts of it. But that's the thing is like look at Bangladesh, look at Kenya right now with the mobilization they had against the finance bill, and now there's a lot of mobilization to try to get the president to resign there. Look at to give a counter example in Venezuela, like how much mobilization there was by the Chavistas to make sure that they defended their candidate, right? To even if people have critiques of Maduro, et cetera, right? Like they said, hey, we're not going
mhm.
back to to the US orbit and the fascists that they want to bring in, right? And so I think this is like the thing too, is to think about all of these ways that are possible in terms of political mobilization that fall well outside, that we don't actually have to always look to revolutionary history or to something far off. We can look at examples that go on in the world right now in terms of how people politically mobilize around
Yes.
issues that they're deeply, care about. So I
Yeah.
appreciate that comment
And
too.
that's not by chance, right? That when you create a global solidarity network and people are out in the streets and these things are being connected to each other, there's a way in which also people uh, you know, siphon energy from that and recognize that there are possibilities of being. That's not without its, prices. But again, if we go back to the condition, we're just like the price is already being paid. And people start, and that is the biggest fear, of course, of power, is that that is why it's a global network that we're sort of seeing an uprising. Just like we see fascist uprising, we're also seeing that folks are insisting on possibilities otherwise, that there are other ways of being, that we're sick and tired of the status quo, that we are actually not going to sit here and take all the shit that we've been asked to take all along. And who are the people, of course, who pay the biggest price for that? I don't think it's by chance that we're seeing all of this happening on a global stage around the same time, right? At the same time, we're also seeing some governments like kick out their colonial overlords.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Africa, the Alliance of Sahel
Right.
states. Yeah, absolutely. Um, all right, last question from the audience. Can the speakers, to whatever extent is the effort to what extent is the effort to silo issues and often identity based resistance to interconnection also a process of psychological warfare?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I hear this all the time, right? You can't be a single issue voter, which is fascinating to me. First of all, if it's a genocide that has murdered upwards of 200,000 people, that has, mobilized empire in a particular way, that plays into a climate catastrophe, that that opens up all the possibilities for all of the other ways in which structures of power can come in and strip us of our basic rights. Like, again, Palestine is the entry point. Everything else comes after that. If that's the single issue, I'm cool with that. Because it's like the blueprint of everything else, right? Like it's about normalizing certain modes of behaving and functioning. And if you have a rogue state that's supported by the biggest empire and rogue state in the world, do you actually think that this toothpaste is going to come back into the tube? There's no way of doing that. And so again, it's resisting also the parameters of this narration of siloed off issues. I just don't think we live in that type of world where issues are siloed off, and it's okay for us to insist, first of all, that even if it were, this right now should be our top priority, right? I saw this other thing that was just like, even if Kamala wins, that you've already you've already put up with a genocide. Like the United States is done for, like on a moral. I mean, many of us knew that already, but what you've already tolerated has already changed you in ways that you can't even imagine, right? What we have witnessed. So again, it's being okay with us saying, yeah, I am going to be a single issue. This is the single issue. How can it fucking not be the single issue when every day to this day we see the burning alive of Palestinians in Gaza in refugee tents? People have been displaced 3-4 times. How can that not be the single issue? So every time we get pulled into defending why, well, it's not really a single issue. It's just like, no, it is a fucking single issue. And it's because you haven't stopped the genocide. That's why it's a single issue. And once you do that, fine, we'll rally behind everything else, but stop the fucking genocide first, right? So it is also us being able to resist that idea that somehow it's out of, because it's tied into everything else, including the flow of capital, including the consolidation of power, including a reconfiguration of the power axes of the world and the decimation of this planet. Like, I want that to be the single issue, right? So I think it's a little bit of a pivot to say that, like, our focus, our actual inducing us to believe that that is really a single issue and that we have to defend why is part of the way that it's psychological warfare.
Right on. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lara. This has been great. And, you know, I think we got to a lot, and I'm sure we'll continue it on. Unfortunately, we have to deal with what's that?
How are you feeling?
Oh, this was good. This I feel a little bit better. You know, it's always good to talk to you and to, you know, talk about some of the stuff that, you know, we see and we deal with. I think the part that I'm like, maybe I'll play one more clip, because the one thing that I am most frustrated with right now is the kind of the pragmatic, it's the realists, right?
Yes.
These are the people that I'm having the hardest time with right now, psychologically, you know, and everything else. So I'm going to play a clip actually from Mark Lamont Hill's Night School, where he had on the executive director of the Working Families Party. And I should say to this, to caveat a little bit, like, you know, it's nothing against these folks personally. Mark Lamont Hill is in Philly, and I attend a lot of events that he puts together. He does a lot in support of Palestine locally, you know. And so, you know, it's not that. I also know people who really look up to this guy from the Working Families Party. His name escapes me right now, but anyway, and I should say they have a strategy, right? They have, which I appreciate. A lot of organizations, it's not, you know, it's just like, we need to mobilize around this, like, that's it, right? And so they invoke a 10-year strategy. But I do think at least what they're attempting to do is take a kind of non-traditional approach to building a third party, right? And so it's a third party that then basically endorses the president every 4 years, right? So that ends up being a Democrat. And, you know, then they run other candidates. Sometimes they run them solo as Working Family Party candidates. Sometimes they endorse Democrats. So kind of similar to DSA in that respect, except that DSA never isn't actually a party. So they don't run candidates as just DSA, right? They're always Democrat usually. Maybe they run them Green Party once or twice, but I don't really think so. So I'm going to play this clip. Let's see, which one do I want to play? I think this is it.
Right? Because we have to both articulate, because I think the language of pragmatism, somehow people believe that pragmatism.
Watch what protein shakes do to your body.
There you go.
Protein drink. You've got almond.
While extreme Republicans push a nationwide abortion ban, Vice President Kamala Harris is standing strong against the attacks on our rights and for federal laws to secure our freedoms. Join her in this fight for our
That's
futures.
hilarious.
Why does every outdoor brand think I want to look like this?
Holy shit.
I know I don't.
Have and advocating for working families and really everybody who's vulnerable in this world. My brother, hopefully we'll see.
Ah, man, it jumped. Damn it. Hang on.
I don't night school. Thank you for breaking this down. Thank you.
That is not it. All right, maybe. All right, I'm not going to play it right now. This is too bad because it's not syncing correctly, and I don't want to jump around and look for it. But basically, you heard a little bit of what he had to say, right? Which is like essentially what he says is that being pragmatic is the most radical thing, right? And so this is the argument, you know, that I'm hearing, that I have friends who, you know, are trying to pose towards me. And yeah, it just I don't know, it doesn't do it for me personally. But I'm thinking, I mean, obviously, like, we could go back to the counterinsurgency stuff, and they say, like, look, these are the people, right, that we want to bring in. They're realistic, they're willing to accept compromises, they work with the political reality as it is, right? And if we can pull them away, and I should give credit, I think this is correct. Somebody said, no, I do not have the ad block. I haven't paid for that. I'm not paying YouTube anything. They take money from me anyways. Yes, I think this is his name. I think it's Maurice Mitchell is the name of that guy. And people can listen to that conversation, although I did feel listening to it like it was a deeply counterinsurgent conversation, I have to say. But I don't know where I was going with that. Anyways, maybe that's a topic for the next time, is just like strategies to deal with the realists, you know. And maybe it's just that you just have to let them go and do their thing, because they're going to do their thing. I mean, that's part of it too, is like they have their statement on why they supported Kamala Harris, which I can actually bring that up. And like, you know, that, you know, 95% of their people voted for it, which says something about the base of people, I think. You know, and again, it goes into what we talked about already. Like, this is the primary message that they have, right? Is that they have to fight Trump, right? And we have to stop the extremists from returning to power. You know, and it will pose itself as like, you know, we're just clear-eyed and it's a binary choice, right? And we're making a decision within this binary choice. So anyways, I don't know if you want to say anything to that. We can also table it for a future discussion. But and I apologize that the video is jacked up by me not having ad blocker and messing up the timestamp there.
It couldn't have been more timely in terms of what it did. So I'm gonna be like therapist-y here and go back to your words before. You're like, I'm having the most trouble with these types of people, and maybe this is where we can end, and just like a placeholder for the next time around it, is that even embedded in that statement of our moral imperative is to not have to have Donald Trump be a one-term president is our focus, is that embedded in that is the assumption or the or the sort of implication that you're not, that's not your your imperative either, that you are okay. That there's all these ways in which there's such a jump in the rational logic. It breaks down so much, and that always is a red flag to me, where just like, you not doing this, or you having a position that might be counter, that's a militant position, makes you then are you okay with the Trump presidency? And it's just like, no, I'm not okay with the fascists, and that's not actually what I'm trying to say. So they might lose the mark, but then you are left to hold the responsibility of them losing that ability to lose that coherence is then on you, and you have to hold that. And so part of why it's difficult to deal with the realist, apart from knowing the counterinsurgency manual and what role realists play, is there's also often an imperiousness that comes with realists, that you somehow are so small-minded and you don't actually see it the way that I see it, and you're willing to give up all these sorts of things that for me also includes a dishonesty. It'd much be easier to deal with pragmatism if they're like, pragmatism is a strategy, and this is the one I am choosing right now because this is the one that I think, is, but instead it's like, wrapped up in this massive narrative that somehow is sold as a political position. And it's just like, no, it's a fucking strategy. And that's the one you're choosing. And it's a strategy that happens to also be used by counterinsurgency. Now, if you can live with that position and argue that position, that's fine. But oftentimes there's like a moralization and imperiousness that comes with that, which and this might be projection, but that's why it's hard for me to deal with realists of that nature.
Yeah, I mean, it is the like, it's also like, you know, they'll present their case, right? And it, you know, and it's fundamentally operating on like, I'm being very rational here. Like, let's be rational. Like, you know, and so then what that says is like, if you don't agree, then you are irrational, right? Then you are emotional, then you are selfish, you are whatever, right? You are, you know, and again, like, it's always, I mean, I don't know that being the most radical is actually a good thing always, but proposing that this is the most radical thing is to be the most pragmatic, right? Is also, you know, I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot of registers in which, like I said, it doesn't work for me. But
Right.
I also think that, I mean, I think also it's because I have other people in my life who operate in a rational level around this, right? Who are leftists, right? Who would like things to be different and better, etc. But they end up always making the kind of cases that this person makes, right? And so like that's part of it too.
Yeah.
Is like, is, you know, the personal aspect of it too.
Yeah. It always makes it harder.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. All right. Maybe we'll pick up that next time, and, you know, I'll see if I can get the clips together a little bit better and maybe not have to jump through ads on them. Some folks had some suggestions on that. So anyways, I appreciate this. This has been a really good conversation again, and it's always good to talk to you. Let's see. I'm gonna pull up Daruba's fundraiser and see before we close out.
Yeah.
How he's doing. Oh, that's amazing. Hang on. That makes me happy. Just going to share this real quick with everybody. So thank you. Wait, refresh. There we are.
Awesome.
So thank you to people who gave. It's great to be able to celebrate that at this moment that his GoFundMe has passed that threshold while we were on the air. I certainly didn't know that would happen. And thank you to all the people who contributed to make that a reality for him. That's great. All right. On that great note, I'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Jay.
Yeah, thank you.